So your sports journalism career started in 1957 at the New York Times, and over the decades you worked with iconic figures like Mickey Mantle, Billie Jean King, Mike Tyson, Howard Cosell, Bob Costas, Lance Armstrong, and even attended Dale Earnhardt's final race. Your career gained momentum in 1964 while covering a little-known boxer at the time known as Cassius Clay, and you even had a memorable moment with the Beatles during a photo session with Muhammad Ali during that 1964 Cassius Clay-Sonny Liston fight. Of all the moments you've experienced in your decades-long career, what is your favorite?
Well, actually, believe it or not, Jesse, it was not any of those. An obscure boxer named Dick Tiger. He had been middleweight champion of the world. He was from Nigeria, and he was caught in America during the Nigerian Civil War, in which his people, the Biafrans, that was the split away state, were being, well, in his mind at least, and certainly in a lot of people in the world, were suffering genocide. And he wanted to send back to the Queen of England his medal. Nigeria was a Commonwealth state, and somewhere along the line when he won the title, the Queen, gave Dick Tiger Order of the British Empire. And he wanted to send it back, and he didn't really quite know how to do it. And he asked me to help him write a letter to the Queen, wrap up this medal, take it to the post office in Manhattan, and mail it. I remember the woman behind the gate at the post office looking at the sloppy way we had wrapped it up, and she said, "So what's this worth?" And I remember Dick Tiger saying in a soft voice, "Nothing." And we sent it off. And for some reason, that has always stuck in my mind, the poignancy of that. This boxer wanting to send this medal back, feeling frustrated, reading about, until he got back home again, reading about the bombing and the murders of his people, and finding this, this white sports writer to come and mail his medal back. There were so many kind of wonderful moments when Mickey Mantle told me to go fuck myself. I think that was probably one of the highest moments. But for some reason, the poignancy of Dick Tiger and his medal has always stuck as the most human and humane moment.
I was reading your memoir called An Accidental Sports Writer, and it's just fascinating, the career you had. And I can't even imagine how much the sports world has changed. Like you mentioned in your memoir that you started at the New York Times in 1957, and you covered the second and the third Super Bowls. And like you mentioned in the book, those athletes had part-time jobs. They weren't even really full-time athletes. And all of a sudden now you got LeBron James is a billionaire. I believe Michael Jordan are billionaires. Like, times have changed significantly. What have been some of the biggest changes that you've seen?
In parallel to that, Jesse, is when I started out, you could have said to LeBron in the locker room right after the game, "Hey man, you want to catch a drink? let's go have a couple and talk." Imagine that now, the layers of press agents that you would have to go through. But I think in a human kind of way, the biggest change for the sports writer was that we traveled in the same chartered airplanes, we stayed in the same hotels, we drank at the same bars, so that there was a much easier access. Plus the fact that getting in and out of the locker room, which is so important right after a game, that hot quote, the discussion of, why did that ball bounce off your head in the outfield, is no longer quite as possible. And then, of course, the money, the television money changed everything. When I started in 1957, print was king. And the TV and radio guys, they came in with their big machines and their extra batteries. And if they were lucky, they try to plug into the locker room wall. And some of the older sports writers would kick their plugs out. It was war. Within a few years, of course, it was all about television. As soon as the athletes and the front offices came to realize they didn't have to depend on the ink-stained wretches to filter their messages to the world, that they could go directly to the fan. And this happened more and more. Radio, television, of course. Once the internet was possible, the print reporter no longer was important in any way. I don't think there's very much print is as important as even, the online, the grunts, the content providers, the guys in the pros sweatshops of the Athletic and ESPN and FL Live. And of course, the fact that so much of it is now controlled, particularly writers who are writing for outlets controlled by the NFL or the NBA. Maybe very good guys, but I think that they know that there's a limit to where they can go with criticism or even the truth.
In your book, you said that you believe that Billie Jean King was the most important sports figure of the 20th century. You say that not only was she the symbolic leader of a movement representing half the world's athletes, but she was also the leader of a revolution that had overthrown the most oppressive concept in sports, amateurism, a dictatorship in which sport officials, well-paid executives, if not wealthy aristocrats, controlled unpaid athletes. I think most people would be surprised if you said that Billie Jean King was the most important sports figure.
She loves to hear it, but as one might imagine. But,
right.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Jesse, because I've just been thinking about it. There's so much in political discourse now. There's so much discussion about attacks on democracy and how that's, if it's successful, it's going to change the world that we live in. And I was thinking about democracy and amateurism as the two great religions of my time. Democracy, obviously, but amateurism, the idea that you are playing games for the love of it, opposite where we are right now in the terrifically monetized games, the commodification of almost everything. The idea of amateurism seems like something of a joke. What? Play for free? I don't do that in high school anymore. And of course, the incredible and recent professionalization of college sports, the NIL and the collectives raising money for particular colleges to be able to recruit high-level athletes, I think has really changed everything. So whereas college sports was kind of a semi-minor league for the NBA and the NFL, now it's going to be very clearly a lower professional league. And we have to keep remembering that when we talk about college sports, we are basically talking about football and basketball. The people who run college sports, the athletic departments, like to muddy the waters by throwing in the squash players and water polo. But that's not who we're talking about at all. We're talking about the big money guys and how important they are to colleges. Whether in the long run this is a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. Most of the stories I've been reading lately are about the Kelf brothers when they were at the University of Cincinnati, and who of the two of them, Jason or Travis, was the biggest asshole or could drink the most beer. I think, that's all very funny and jolly, and maybe that's really what we want in terms of college sports. It's fun. In some ways, it still holds on to the idea that, well, these guys aren't total mercenaries. But of course they are, and should be.
I've read recently that there's something like 12 or 15 college players that make more money than Brock Purdy, the starting quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, who's playing in the NFC Championship game this weekend.
Yeah. I was kind of shocked that the figure was that the average varsity football player was making $300,000 in what the collectives had. That just seems like too much. I mean, too many of these squads have 85 guys on it. They can't all be making, that kind of money. But it's certainly indicative of that's where sports is now. And being a very old man and having started, as you pointed out, so long ago, I think my general feeling was negative towards all this. But, now the more I think about it, why not? These guys work really hard. They have great talents. They're not going to have it so easy later on from a physical point of view. I've never interviewed a former NFL player, for example, who can stand up easily out of a soft chair. I mean, they just can't do it. Their bodies, they're just in such pain. And that so many of them end up bankrupt. And particularly, I mean, we have to remember the racial aspect of it. Most of these guys are Black and coming out of communities where they are carrying dozens of people on their backs, sometimes out of dire poverty. And that $1 million is not going to last very long. And if it's, if they're not really making well above the lower levels, they're in big trouble. So I think I've come to the part of being kind of very libertarian about all this. I really hope that ball players make as much money as they can, because I certainly see that the owners, a despicable bunch of right-wing jerks, are making a lot of money. Are making a lot of money in a business that is not even usually their primary business. They own what? They own shipyards, they own Walmart, whatever they own. And on the side, to show off their manhood, they've got a ball team, which also makes them more and more important within their community and certainly helps them with their primary businesses. So I think in the long run, we sports writers, we kind of dump on the players and we don't look hard enough at the owners.
How has the popularity of certain sports changed? You covered the first few Super Bowls. Football was nowhere near as popular. I think it was like baseball probably and boxing.
Everything was totally different. As I said, from a day-to-day human point of view, the 1969 Super Bowl, when the Jets won, Joe Namath guaranteed the game. Well, the biggest problem to interview Joe Namath in the days leading up to that Super Bowl was making your way through the crowds of kids and little old ladies who were surrounding Joe Namath at the hotel pool. There was Joe Namath. He was out there sunning himself at the pool, surrounded by these people, talking to everybody, signing autographs. And if you wanted to get to talk to them at the interview, you had to kind of push your way through all these little kids. And nowadays, I don't think you're going to see a scenario like that, not with these very established, elaborate press conferences where you move from booth to booth to have a moment or two with some third-string cornerback who's the only one who's free.
The moment that propelled your career was 1964 when you covered Cassius Clay, and then you've covered Muhammad Ali numerous times after that and kind of had an interesting relationship with him. What was your relationship like with Cassius Clay?
Well, I was there really on a fluke. So Cassius Clay had never beaten anybody really important. He really had no right to be contending for the championship, but boxing needed a warm body to fight Sonny Liston. I guess they figured customers would like to see this charming young man beaten to pieces. So the fight was made. And at the New York Times, the boxing reporter, and it was a very important job in those days. It's not, certainly not now, but boxing was big. And the boxing reporter did not think it was worth his time to go all the way down to Miami to cover this fight, which would be over in less than a minute. Sonny would pulverize the kid. So he said to the sports editor, why don't you send the kid? He's not doing anything. I'm the kid. I was in my early 20s, around the same age as Cassius Clay. And the instructions that I got when I left New York to cover the fight were, as soon as you get to Miami, rent a car and drive back and forth between the arena where the fight is going to be held and the nearest hospital, because we want you not to waste any deadline time following Cassius Clay into intensive care. I actually did that. But in any case, so most of the reporters down there were older men, older to me, 40s, 50s, and they hung around with Sonny Liston in his camp, which included Joe Louis and other famous fighters. And the few of us who were younger, in our 20s and 30s, hung out with Cassius Clay because it was fun. There were jokes. The first day that I was there, the Beatles showed up for a photo op. So we hung out with the Beatles, who were raucous little guys. And I interviewed them, like, who do you think is going to win? The wank is going to knock the shit out of him. I'm betting on Liston. And they took their photo op. And it was very interesting because Cassius, who really didn't know who they were, some touring British band, but he was friendly to everybody, they all went into the ring, the practice ring, together and began cavorting around. And the Beatles lined up in a row. Cassius hit the first one lightly on the chin. They all went down like dominoes. Then they created a pyramid so that they could be tall enough to punch at his face. And it really looks as if they had choreographed all of this in advance. And I know that it was a very first meeting, so they were all great performers. And then, of course, they all went off. The Beatles had originally set up a photo op with Sonny Liston, the champ, and he took one look at them, and he said, I ain't posing with them sissies. So the Beatles were set away. But again, this is the idea of how loose and open and accessible everything was in the 60s. None of this would happen now. So I spent that week mostly with him, and I guess we kind of forged, I would never say we were friends, but we forged a relationship that lasted over 50 years. I would keep seeing him, we would keep talking. I think that I understood him. I had just recently written a book with a famous, at that time, Black comedian and civil rights activist named Dick Gregory. The name of the book, you'll have to put your hands over your ears for, the name of the book, which was a bestseller in its time, was called, and it certainly opened up the Black world for me. Sometimes I went to see Cassius, then Muhammad Ali, with Dick Gregory. We had a relationship over the years. It included Malcolm X. I got to be friendly with him. And I think that it's not that anything was special for me or I was special anyway, but he understood that I was open. And a lot of sports writers were not open to him. Famous sports writers of that time, Red Smith, Jimmy Cannon, Dick Young, rejected him, felt he had no right to be any kind of role model or to be an important person in the firmament of American sports stars. He gave up Christianity, became a Muslim. He refused to be drafted. He was very controversial at that time, and he belonged to the Black Muslims, as they were called, which was a segregational sect. They were looking for a piece of land in Mississippi in cahoots with white supremacists for an all-Black state. So that's where he was early on. He changed, of course, enormously afterwards. But in that early period, he was very controversial. A lot of older sports writers and more conservative people despised him. Later on, when he became kind of a teddy bear in America, kind of was almost secular saint, I think that people forgot all about that. And by the time that, with his shaking hand, he lit the Olympic torch, I think that he really was an American hero. And if anything made him an American hero, I think it probably was being such an open and gallant Parkinson's disease sufferer. He gave a lot of people hope and inspiration in that. And during that time, I think people forgot that a lot of people hated him.
Before he was protesting the Vietnam War, and then after, he had just a massive transformation, and was that like a 4 or 5 year period?
Right. But he transformed, but America transformed. Certainly when it came to civil rights, when it came to the Vietnam War, which he was against. So it's as if America caught up to him. And yet he himself never really changed. He told the same silly, bigoted jokes when he was in his 60s that he told when he was in his 20s. He knew I was Jewish, and every time he saw me, he would say, "So, Bob, what's the difference between a canoe?" "I don't know." He said, "A canoe tips." And that was the level of his humor. It was, he was very sweet, very kindly guy, but at the same time, I think in many ways he had the emotions of a 3-year-old. I loved him. And also, I have to admit, he was very important to my career. I was a kid on Night Rewrite at the Times. I'm sent down to cover this fight. Everybody liked my coverage, and I came back to New York a made man. And then after that, I covered him and covered a number of other things. And very soon after that, I was made a columnist. It was very important to me, and I've been grateful to him ever since.
Your memoir is called An Accidental Sports Writer. Basically, you start out saying that after you graduated from Columbia, you planned on going to California, but then you got this job at the New York Times, and then all of a sudden you had the Muhammad Ali coverage in 1964. Then all of a sudden he kind of made this career. Are you happy that you became an accidental sports writer? What did you really want to focus on? What did you want to write?
Well, I wanted to write fiction. My plan was to go out to California, which was the farthest that you could get from Queens, where I grew up. And I would either write screenplays or novels or starve or, sit by the pool. I had a whole different idea of what my life would be like. I had applied to graduate school in California, got in, wanted a job for the summer in New York before I went out there. And the job that I got was copy boy in the sports department. I don't know. Had that job been copy boy in the shipping news department or in dance, I think things might have worked out differently. I might have gone to California. I was not a wild sports fan, so it was not a good mix that way. And I hated the job. It was a terrible job. Basically, what you did was got coffee for dyspeptic old men at midnight, sharpened their pencils, and then in those days, you would get them kind of jars full of library paste, which was part of how they pasted up the stories that they were working on. It was all very rudimentary then. It was, the process of sports putting a paper together was as rudimentary as sports was in those days. But I really fell in love with the New York Times. I fell in love with this idea of some sort of cult of truth and goodness. And then, of course, and things worked out well for me quickly. But, no, I mean, I think it's too late to have any regrets or to look back. It was fun. I had a really good time, and I'm in a good place now. But it's interesting. I tell people that you can plan all you want, but the best thing you can do is just make sure you're in good shape for when something accidentally happens, good or bad.
Yeah, in the book you talk that I believe it was in 1976. You actually interviewed, was it David Berkowitz, aka the Son of Sam, and was he a serial killer in the 1970s? There was like movies made of him. What was it like meeting the Son of Sam and doing an interview with him?
Yeah, it was very bizarre and very strange. A publishing house had worked out some sort of deal with the Son of Sam's lawyers to smuggle me, pretending to be a doctor, smuggling me into Kings County Mental Hospital, Brooklyn, to see if I could relate to him, get along with him. And he was kind of small and sweet, and kind of soft in its way, and perceptive, because we were talking for a few minutes, and he noticed that I had in my hand my pen pointed towards him like this. And he commented on the aggressive nature of that. And I figured, what the hell? I mean, he busted me. And I said, well, yeah, supposedly you have all these supernatural powers. So if you jump me, I'm prepared to stick this right into your throat, kill you. And he laughed. And that somehow, I mean, I hadn't been smart enough to do it purposefully, but that kind of broke the ice between us. And we talked. And I realized that he was going to be a very good and open interview, and that the book was going to be $1 million bestseller. But then afterwards, after this very successful interview, I came to realize that the way that the deal had been structured, that half the money was going to be filtered back to Son of Sam's lawyers for his defense. And I thought to myself, man, I don't think I want to be working for Son of Sam's defense. It's a fucking killer. And so I bailed out. And soon after that, I don't think anybody ever really did the book and made money on it. I don't really know. I think that there were several books that came out, and which of them had deals with the lawyers, I have no idea. And soon after that, they enacted the so-called Son of Sam law, which meant that nobody could profit, even indirectly, from a crime, which I think is a good thing. I was just surprised at just how sweet and soft and perceptive he was. And he really caught the vibe. I guess I was scared. He really caught the vibe of me ready to, to jam my pen into his throat. Or maybe it was too many James Bond books I'd read.
Right. I mean, I guess that's like anything where if you could do things for fun and they're fun, but as soon as you tie it to work, then it becomes work and it doesn't really become fun anymore. Would you say that a lot of your colleagues, I mean, is like they're sports fans, and then as soon as they get into the business, are they still sports fans, or do they view it more as work? Are they able to separate the game from the person and be able to be objective, or do you think that they're trying to write favorably towards the...
That's a really interesting question, and there are probably general answers and, of course, individual answers. But I think that some sports writers became sports writers because they wanted to be writers, and this was an easy way in. And some became sports writers because they loved sports. They had been fans all their lives, and this would get them even closer to their heroes. And some of those guys are really so knowledgeable because they've been collecting cards and statistics since they're 6 years old. They know everything. But I think they're also lamed in a way by their emotional attachment to teams and to ball players, that they're still a little starry-eyed, and it's very hard for them to write clearly. On the other hand, there's something in sports fandom, and this is a dichotomy I've never fully understood, in which a lot of these fans hate the objects of their affection. And also, you notice how quick some sports writers are to turn on athletes. Suddenly Aaron Rodgers, who was the smartest, slickest, nicest guy in the world, and now he's evil incarnate. And he hasn't changed. He's just a very complicated figure. But, turning on Taylor Swift, my God, she's destroying the game as we know it. But I think that it almost depends on the individual, but it's really hard for a hardcore sports fan to be a fair journalist as well. But I don't want to load this on sports writers because I see this in entertainment writers. I certainly see this in political writers, those who have their own ideas of what's right or wrong and cover in those ways.
With the specific case of Aaron Rodgers, he got hurt 4 plays into the season. If he was playing well and the Jets were in the playoffs and he said the exact same things, I feel like the coverage of him would be different. If he's throwing 40 touchdown passes and winning another MVP, but when you're sitting on the sidelines, it's a lot easier. It's, because the New York media would be going really soft. If the Jets were playing the Ravens this weekend or the Chiefs, whatever, they'd be like, oh, Brett Favre, greatest guy's really, really smart, really lucid or whatever, they'd be saying.
I think you hit it on, and you're absolutely right, Jesse. If the Jets were playing the Ravens this week, the sports writers would be saying, no vaccinations.
Yeah, they would do a 180. And then with the whole Taylor Swift thing, she's just in so many commercials, and so is Travis Kelce, that I think it's almost like people, they build these people up and then they get torn down, but it's like that overexposure where it's just what's the right amount of exposure or commercials for Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce? I think they've crossed the threshold, but that's what the media does, right? They build you up only to tear you down later. You talked about that in the book. I felt like with Tiger Woods.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I also think that, Taylor Swift kind of impinges on the ultra masculinity of football. Football is really about, Jason bare-chested, in the box. It's not about Travis helping Taylor out of the car.
When Tom Brady was dating Giselle, I felt like they were trying to go after the woman audience, get more women to like football. And then they broke up shortly after Brady retired. And now I feel like with Taylor, there's rumors that they're not even dating, that it's just like the NFL setting them up for publicity to try to get more women to watch. And I feel like when you're talking about the billions of dollars that are involved in football, I wouldn't put anything past the NFL for marketing.
No, I think you're right about that. But I also think that we're dealing with two incredible juggernauts, neither of which really need each other very much.
No. I also believe in your book in 1976, you met Jackie Kennedy Onassis at a writer's benefit. Is that true? Did you meet Jackie? How was meeting Jackie? That's John F. Kennedy's widowed wife at the time.
If it had been in a more formal occasion, I would have been, a puddle. But it was a cocktail party. She was dating Pete Hamill, who was a friend, a colleague that I knew. And what was really interesting is she had just started a job as an editor at a publishing house, where she apparently was actually a real editor. And so she comes into this cocktail party, and there are pencil smudges on her cheek. And you know, I was really taken aback. And couldn't take my eyes off, neither could my wife. The idea of this most elegant, fashionable woman of the world, and her cheek is full of the pencil marks from her day-to-day job. And she was extremely sweet. I mean, she was just incredibly nice. And we didn't talk all that long. But during the discussion, Pete Hamill said something to me like, I was not working at the time. Pete Hamill said something that, so this guy from Australia, Rupert Murdoch, he just bought the New York Post. You should call him up and tell him you're available. And I said, yeah, right. I'm going to call him. What do I know? He doesn't know me. And in her little piping voice, Jacqueline Kennedy says, oh, Pete, why don't you call him up for Bob? And Pete said, I will. And he did. And I had very interesting 7 months at the New York Post. But, so, I mean, there was really something really very, very nice about her. I think I've met like Bill and Hillary at some White House reception for Muhammad Ali. And it was just, we walk past them and shake their hands. Hi, I'm blah, blah, and I know that I was just kind of stunned because both of them were kind of shiny people. And she was much better looking than anything I had ever seen in pictures or on television. And he was big and handsome. And so there was that kind of moment of being dazzled the first time. But I didn't feel that with Jackie because she just seemed, the smudges, and she seemed so human. But it's interesting, you were talking about my regrets. So no, I mean, I've met some really wonderful people. And as you pointed out in the beginning, I would have to say Billie Jean King, who I love dearly, was certainly one of them. I think her importance, particularly to half the world, women, and as we talked about, the amateurism, and she's just great. And she's always full of interesting things to say. Most recent thing that she said that really struck me was we were talking about pressure, the pressure of being president, the pressure of playing for the Wimbledon championship. I said, what are you talking about? She said, pressure is a privilege. You've gotten somewhere. You're on the brink of something really important happening, of doing something critical. You should be very proud that you are earning that pressure. And I thought, wow, who thinks of things in that way? And it's a very lively mind at work. So, I spent years at ESPN, and we would always do these shows, who's number one? And I got into so many fights there. Michael Jordan is number one, or somebody historical, Babe Ruth. No, it's Billie Jean King. He would look at me, are you crazy? It's a woman, for goodness sake. Who would you pick as number one?
For just overall of any sport, or in terms of like most impactful or just the greatest? How would you?
Your call, the most important sports figure of your time, of all time.
The only sport I really watch is the NFL, so I'm not really too sure. And for a Packer fan, it's probably Reggie White. He was really the first free agent. He signed with the Packers, I believe, in '92, whatever. I think it was 4 years, $17 million. I'm not into boxing or the NBA or baseball. I actually had box tickets to a game at Coors Stadium, and I left after like the third inning. I was like, man, like this, it's not that fun.
Really?
But yeah, I was actually in the Coors box, and they ran out of beer. I was like, how do you run out of beer when you're in a stadium called the Coors, But you're a little bit older than me. I would imagine at the time when Billie Jean King was playing, the difference between women's sports and men's sports was obviously huge. Now, what is there, like women figure skaters make more than men? I think women gymnasts, like there's some sports where women,
Yeah.
back in the 1960s, you never would have thought that day would ever come.
Well, also her importance in the enactment of Title IX, which suddenly opened up sports in colleges, the feeding grounds. The WNBA, is nowhere near the NBA and probably never will be, but it probably wouldn't exist at all if it wasn't for Title IX. I mean, my daughter would not have played field hockey. She had a wonderful high school career. It was very important to her, to a lot of young girls who really kind of found themselves physically and emotionally through sports.
If I'm doing the recency bias, I just recently saw the movie about Michael Jordan. Was it called Air Jordan with Ben Affleck and Matt Damon? Was it Air?
Yeah.
Yeah, Air, right, where basically with him signing with Nike and getting that shoe contract, and then what does he make, $400 million a year with his rights, and really kicked open the door for a lot of the current NBA players and other players in different sports with these big sponsorships. I allowed him to buy an NBA team. And so I would say if you're talking like off the field or off the court, whatever, Michael Jordan of my lifetime probably has to be the most impactful.
Yeah, Jeff, one of the things that really interested me about that movie is you never really saw Michael Jordan or the Michael Jordan figure in that movie. And the metaphor for me for that was that he really existed more in the deals than he did as a person. He was a wonderful ball player, and I love to watch him. I still think that he's more watchable than LeBron. I mean, he was thrilling, as was Kobe. But I think that he was a creation of the marketplace as much as anything else. And that really had profound effects on sports and really lead to his importance. Sure. But you could say Babe Ruth because he was the first really great celebrity athlete. And Jim Thorpe, maybe he was the best, or Jim Brown. Maybe they were the best athletes of all time. Who knows? These comparisons are kind of silly, and they're really for bars at midnight.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, usually if you read like some list, you'll have Jackie Robinson will be at the top, Jim Thorpe, those, it's whatever is your criteria. There's never a right answer or a wrong answer. It's just an opinion. Talking about libertarian before, you were talking about in your book on the issue of PEDs and steroids in sports, and you said you were basically fine with it. The only time I've ever watched baseball was during the 90s when Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire going for that home run record. And like you mentioned in the book, all these reporters pretty much could see these transformations. Like they just didn't write about it because they were selling papers and the ratings were high. And I'm with you. I actually don't really have a problem with the use of PEDs. I think ultimately it's entertainment, and these sports are a lot more entertaining when these guys are superhuman. You wrote your memoir in 2011, so that's 13 years ago now. I guess we're in 2024. But has your opinion on the use of PEDs changed?
Yeah, I think that if there was a real kind of enforcement, I would be more comfortable, simply because I think that the danger of steroids is on developing minds and bodies. It can really do serious damage to a 16, 17, 18-year-old kid. A 30-year-old pitcher hanging on by his fingernails, who cares? I think that these things are accessible. They're basically good drugs. They help. I don't have really strong feelings about older athletes. The whole point of steroids is that you repair more quickly. All the things that you tear in the course of a game, you shoot up and you heal faster. Critical to your 34-year-old slugger or pitcher or something like that. Keep that stuff away from kids. I really don't have really strong feelings about it. I would let the justice of the locker room prevail, because if it really would make such a difference, don't you think that guys in the locker room would be beating the shit out of Barry Bonds back then? I mean, they wouldn't let him get away with that. And then there are sports, the Tour de France. I can't conceive of, bicycling up the Pyrenees, without drugs. It's crazy. And of course, it didn't come about just because some guy wanted bigger muscles. It came about because some owners wanted more home runs, because the whole idea of bigger and better and power really had to do with ticket sales. And so I think that there was that kind of openness. I remember having dinner with a major league owner, and we were not that close personally. Believe it or not, it was at a family dinner, and he was kind of a distant connection. And I said, so, how do you let your guys, and it was his guys, how do you let your guys do that stuff? You barely drink, you're against any kind of vice or violation. He said, I have nothing to do with it. I have absolutely nothing to do with it. My front office deals with the players on that level. And I thought, you hypocritical bastard. You know exactly what's going on. And you know that's why your attendance shot up the last couple of years. And you're telling me that you know nothing about it. That's been the story in sports. It's so interesting that they've never really managed to trace anything back to where the money for the drugs, where the access to the locker room, where the openness that these guys having their personal physical trainers, I think personal nurses. I think it was really kind of always part of it. And of course, in bicycle racing, which was kind of the most vivid, team-sponsored drugs.
Yeah. With like Lance Armstrong, before he had cancer, he wasn't very good at the Tour de France. He was more of one of a sprinter, and all of a sudden he wins like 7 in a row. And for Barry Bonds and Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire, those guys were hitting barely 40 or 50 home runs, and all of a sudden they're hitting 60 and 70 and they were just huge. Barry Bonds, didn't his helmet go up like 4 sizes or something? Like,
that's right.
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 Yeah. Like everyone knew it. And I believe at the time it wasn't even against the rules of baseball. And now they're talking about, should these guys get into the Hall of Fame? And now they're just kind of like vilified. At the time, though, ESPN would like cut from their show to like, oh, Barry Bonds is that bad, or Mark Sosa is that bad. We're going to cut from Scott Van Pelt or whoever was on the air. Or, was it Dan Patrick at the time? Probably was in ESPN.
Yeah, I mean, and ESPN has always been an accomplice in all of this. I remember when ESPN took its name off the documentary that PBS had made with them about steroids in sports. Well, ESPN is something else entirely. But it's interesting. What's interesting now is the kind of breakdown of all the great sports media sites. Sports Illustrated is going down. ESPN has come up with a number of scandals that make you really wonder about its authenticity. The New York Times, my alma mater, gave up its own sports department to outsource its coverage. So my first thought was, wait, does this mean that they think sports doesn't matter anymore? It's not worth covering? Or have they come to the point where they felt that sports is not news anymore? It's sheer entertainment, and it should be handled in that way, unless they're covering a bona fide scandal.
Well, it just seems like it's just changing technologies, right? You even mentioned in your book how Bill Simmons is one of the first kind of independent sports writers with his blog. But if you're one of the Sports Illustrated where you have 100 writers and this massive staff, you have this big bloat versus like having, I don't know, a podcast where you got a team of 2 people, right? And now, especially with AI and it just doesn't seem like it's a business model that's going to go forward, regardless of, like I said, it's not just sports. It's, well, there's political. You've seen a lot of other publications go out of business regardless.
I'm sure you're right about that. Plus the fact that what we're really seeing is subtle at first, but it's going to be more and more the merger of sports and sports media. And it's most obvious right now at ESPN, which makes absolute sense. The NFL wants to control the information, and ESPN really doesn't believe it's sustainable to keep paying these incredible fees for rights. And sports is really about live drama. That's, to see the game. And when you think about it, of course, the fact almost all the most watched television shows have been sports shows, mostly NFL. But the idea is sports is the last unscripted, quote, authentic shows on television. Sports is actually truly happening in front of you. Everything else, including the reality shows, which are heavily scripted, are not. So it will be interesting. Maybe we'll just come to the point where, hey, it's just entertainment. It's fine. As long as, and here is, of course, the great caution, as long as it remains being true. As soon as they start messing with the final outcome, until we find out that ESPN or the NFL or NBC, whatever, has fixed some aspect of a game, either who won or lost or how well a hero does, we're okay. But I just wonder if sooner or later we will come to that point where they will be messing with the game itself. And of course, the great specter behind all of that is the gambling industry. So when I'm starting out, the NFL suspends two of its biggest stars, Paul Hornung and Alex Karras, for betting. Not betting on themselves, just for betting. Now, every league seems to have its own official gambling website.
Do you think that they've ever manipulated anything? I recently had a podcast with Sean Patrick Griffin about the Tim Donaghy scandal, where he was the ref. I think it was it 2004, 2005, 2006. He had 4 NBA seasons where he was fixing games. And then he basically, of course, taking a word from a convicted felon, but he was basically saying that the NBA would give him storylines. And then you've seen some of the worst officiated games in the NBA where, like, everyone kind of remembers the Sacramento Kings versus the Lakers with the Chris Webber. What was that, 2004, I believe. But if you get a referee involved, it's not like you need to get the players to go along with it. I think it would be leaked. But if you just have one referee, or like Tim Donaghy, where he just acts kind of alone because he's making so much more money. He could make more money in one game. Not that he did, but you could have a ref that could make more money in one game than they did on their whole salary.
Right. And in football, all you need is an assistant defensive coach. Just need to know a couple of plays.
Yeah, and that's why people are stealing each other's signs and things like that. It just doesn't seem that hard. My thought process at the beginning of the year was, I'm like, I guarantee you, I shouldn't say guarantee, but I was like, I feel really confident that the Kansas City Chiefs will be in the Super Bowl because the NFL is shoving this Taylor Swift thing down your throat so much. I'm like, it's probably going to be San Francisco and then Kansas City Chiefs to promote Taylor Swift. That was kind of my thought process, and it looks like we might have that. I don't know. It doesn't mean it's rigged, but that was the way I was thinking. But maybe I'm just a conspiracy theorist, whatever.
No, I mean, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. Actually, baseball could have better matchups in the World Series. They should start thinking about that.
Right. I mean, because the NFL is the most popular show. I mean,
Yes.
it's basically a soap opera. Like the draft gets the NFL draft, and now they spread the draft out to 3 days. That gets better ratings than pretty much any other finals of any other league. I mean, like they figured out how to, and like, why wouldn't they manipulate storylines? That's what a good producer of a TV show would do, which is basically what they're at now.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. If you think about the NFL as America's soap opera, certainly male soap opera, but I think more and more women, the inclusion of Taylor Swift is genius. That not only brings it up to a higher level in women, but kids. My 16-year-old granddaughter has her tickets to Taylor Swift's Toronto concert next summer. Really. And all her friends are doing it. And it starts very early. It starts at 9, 10, whatever. So they're inculcating new fans. I think it's great. But I think that it's easy to be a conspiracy theorist and things like that. Because there's always been talk about fixed games. We know that there are an awful lot of fixed basketball games. There were.
And when I had that Sean Patrick Griffin on, he actually brought up something I never even thought of, but he says he thinks the big thing in gambling and fixing games going forward is actually with fantasy football, or I should say fantasy sports, where it's like you're betting on an individual player to score points in a league, and maybe you look to throw an extra pass to that receiver to get those points or do whatever sport. But he's like, he thinks that's kind of the evolution.
Well, and that makes absolute sense, because I just saw an ad for one of the sites that claims to be ahead of all other sites in the different kinds of ways you can bet on the internal workings of a game.
And one of the things that I found interesting when you're talking about in your memoir was when you were talking about NASCAR, and you were actually at Dale Earnhardt's final race when he crashed into the wall. But you talked about how you actually got into one of those NASCARs and drove it around a track, and it seemed like you got a little bit invested in that in NASCAR, which you never really thought you would. It had to be pretty awesome to be driving that car with, was it 620 horsepower or whatever?
It was. And I had asked the Times for permission to do it. I worked for them. And they said, absolutely not. I guess their feeling was they didn't want to take care of my wife and children afterwards. But I did it anyway. After spending time covering it, you really want to know what it's feeling. And I actually got a ride. One of the drivers gave me a ride around. He was driving and I was kind of crouched under the wheel. And that was pretty exciting. And he was going pretty fast. But I've never really felt the thrill. Well, actually, I have to take that back. Because the truth is that it was so intense an experience that for the whatever time I was there, no other thought ever intruded. And I have to think that in everything I've ever done, food, sex, fights, whatever, some little thought is going to intrude somewhere. But while I was driving that car by myself, everything was so intensely focused on making the turn, staying close to the wall on the straightaway, breaking back down again at the turn, making each movement that I've been coached in. I never thought of anything else. It was just an amazing experience. So the thought was this the most thrilling time in your life? I don't really know, because there was no time even for the thrill, the self-consciousness of realizing what I was doing. It was all about the process itself and not crashing. And then afterwards, when you think about it, you think that I was all alone on the track, right? I think they also cleared some spectators away from the lower grandstand. Thought we'd crash into them. But I'm all alone on the track. And these guys are with 30 odd other cars bumping them. And my admiration for race car drivers is boundless. I mean, yeah, everybody says the hardest thing in the world is hitting a fastball. Maybe, but can't be anything like going around a track at speed with other cars trying to run you off.
Yeah, you're like in that state of flow or the zone, whatever they want to call it. You're like some Buddhist monk out there just getting into the nothingness or the transcendence, whatever. That's pretty awesome. When you were at parties and stuff, especially when you were in your prime working years, were you the most popular guy at the party? Did people want tickets or hear these stories?
Well, yeah, people were, yeah, but I didn't really kind of run in that kind of crowd. But I made it really clear really early that I didn't get tickets for people. My son is still, he's in his 50s, he's still fielding questions from friends saying, "Oh, what a childhood you must have had. You went to every great event." And he said, "No, my dad hardly ever took me to anything." And I didn't. I didn't take the kids because I was a conspiracy theorist. I didn't want to be into the promoters. I did, you could get tickets. You get tickets for anything. You get free tickets for anything. But then the next time something came around and the press agent said, could you be a little easy on Jesse? He was drunk last night and he didn't mean it when he slugged the manager. I mean, there's always stuff like that comes up all the time. And I really wanted my freedom. As I said, I was not a total sports fan. I didn't feel any kind of emotional attachment to the games, or to the idea of the games, to the athletes. Well, I mean, some I liked a lot. And I also always thought that I was going to quit the next day and go do something else, go to California, write my screenplays. And my mind was in a different place. Yeah, people hit you up from time to time, but then they come to realize and to respect the fact that you really don't want to do that. Yeah. But I still talk about it with my son. Yeah, he says, "You could have taken me to the World Series."
We talked about how sports has changed over the years since you started at the times in 1957, but how much has just the U.S. or the world changed between are you 85? Is that what I read on the Google? How old are you?
I'm 86, yeah.
Oh, you're 86 now, yeah. Well, yeah, congrats on that. I believe it was your father, I think you said, lived 101 years old?
Yeah.
Is that what, right? So that's in this, hopefully you hit the century.
I think he was in better shape at 100 than I am now, but yeah. He was,
oh, really?
Yeah.
He hit the, it's pretty impressive.
Mentally.
Oh, mentally, right, mentally. But I mean, you've seen a lot. I mean, especially with your career flying around the country and traveling around and hanging out with Muhammad Ali and stuff. But how much has the U.S., do you think the U.S. has changed more than the sports has changed? I feel like the sports is always kind of a mirror of society.
Yeah, but it's not a complete mirror. It really isn't. I think that the divisiveness that we see now, the polarities, in terms of America, there have been enormous changes in America. But, it was interesting. So in the 80s, Donald Trump was a football owner, and I interviewed him a number of times through the 80s and the 90s. And what was so interesting then is he was exactly the same as he is now, but we didn't take him seriously. He was this buffoon who was trying to shoulder his way into the New York real estate market. And I remember the first time that I interviewed him in the 80s, he had bought a team, the New Jersey Generals. And I said, I think I was on television at the time. It was on television. I said, Mr. Trump, there's a kind of a strong rumor around that the whole idea of these new teams, your new league, is to put pressure on the NFL for a merger. He was very accessible. He was very genial. He was very nice. And he said, "Oh, we just met. "Oh, Bob, no, it's nothing like that." He said, "The whole idea is to give America 12 months of football. We'll be off season. We're not going to in any way try to impinge on the NFL." The next morning in the newspapers, he was the lead litigant in a suit to force the NFL to merge with his league. And I mean, I was just, after that, I was just kind of entranced. The absolute shameless, wonderful ability to lie, and to lie so convincingly and so winningly and so genially, about something that obviously he and his group have been talking about all day, and then my interview. And then the idea from NASCAR, I really had the sense, more than in any other sport that I covered, and I covered a lot of NASCAR, the realization that there were two Americas, at least two Americas, and the idea of people really afraid of each other, of antagonistic. The idea that, on the one hand, when I went down to cover NASCAR, I was writing a column for the New York Times at the time. And the sports editor, who was a very smart man, said that he thought that NASCAR was going to be the big new sport. And it was for a couple of years. And I should go down and write some columns about it. And I was welcomed by the bureaucrats of NASCAR, because this was going to be accessed and in the New York Times. But the people themselves, the mechanics, the audience, the drivers, were very wary, because I represented the New York Eastern feet, the elite. And you could really see that there was that kind of tension. It eventually evaporated. If you ask enough people about carburetors and restrictor plates and things like that, then they'll kind of calm down and kind of focus on the mechanics of it all. But you could really see that there were striations, plus the fact that most of the races were in the South. So, if you were in Alabama or wherever you were, in many ways in a different country. So I don't know that America really changed in that sense, but the expression certainly changed. The shamelessness kind of changed, and the willingness to hate so openly changed. And, I just remember in my time in sports writing in the beginning, you would get nasty mail, of course. Sports writers always get nasty mail, but the mail kind of looked like ransom notes. They were kind of written in block letters. And then by the late 90s, the letters which said the same thing, fuck you, die, were written on embossed stationery. And at the bottom, that little mark with the slash that showed that it had been dictated to a secretary. Man. So, I think it's kind of the expression of the hatred, which has always been there. It's kind of really scary.
Talking about the football before, the changing, was it the Chiefs and the Dolphins game was the first game that was ever streamed. They had that streamed on Peacock. Do you think that's going to be the future of pro sports? They're still going to be live. It's about the only live event that people watch. But do you think we'll just be streaming everything instead of actually watching it on TV, as we've talked, these big corporate media companies kind of going under?
I don't know. I think, like a lot of Americans, my wife and I are trying to figure out how are we going to deal with all this stuff that we're paying for every month? What cables are we going to cut? How can we keep BritBox and maybe we'll get rid of ESPN? We don't know what we're going to do. This is a critical and interesting time. We're going to see where America goes in its viewing habits and how force, particularly the NFL, as you pointed out, is going to drive that change? I have no idea, but I think it's really an interesting and critical time. What do you think? I mean, is that how we want to watch football? I don't know.
I thought there was a lot of pushback on it. It's one of the few things that people actually go to regular TV to watch is sporting event. I mean, 40 million people watch the Dallas Cowboys and the Green Bay Packers. If you were to have to sign up for a streaming service and pay for it, those numbers would be way less. I wouldn't pay for it, but I don't know.
Well, almost everything we watch is streaming now. There's no appointment TV. And Blockbuster, we went to Blockbuster and we certainly got those red envelopes in the mail. And it doesn't seem that long ago. So things are changing really fast. And will football sustain? I mean, it seems like it's going to be with us forever. But, remember boxing teleprompters and closed circuit television? I don't know. I have no, it's moving too fast for me.
Yeah, football's king now, but you said baseball was king. I mean, horse racing was huge, right, for a while, boxing, and then you had...
Oh. Well, when I started, horse racing and boxing and golf.
And golf, right.
Golf is just about the only one that's sustained. It's still on television, but horse racing, other forms of gambling kind of wiped that out. And certainly mixed martial arts and other forms of violence it kind of took care of boxing.
There's a resurgence when Tyson was popular in his heyday, but really since Tyson wasn't in his prime, it's just been MMA.
Yeah, but it's always possible if another charismatic athlete emerges, like Tyson, like Cassius Clay, there will be a resurgence of interest, I think. But I don't think any of the martial arts athletes have really captured the whole country the way a major heavyweight boxer like Jack Dempsey, Joe Louis, Cassius Clay, etc. has.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And you met Mike Tyson several times. In your book, you talk about, like, you met a young Mike Tyson.
Well, I met Mike Tyson when he was 13, and I thought he was really smart and sensitive, and he had that little lisp, which, and I had been friends with Customato, who became his adoptive father, was his manager, and who brought him to live with him in the country and train him. And I think that, Mike obviously has mental, emotional issues, but D'Amato was able to pretty much keep him under control, more or less, but he died just before Mike won the heavyweight championship. And once he had won the title, he kind of totally spun out of control. And he became bizarre, and a lot of it was medication and the fluxes and flows in his temperament. But he seems under control now. He's almost like a warm and comic figure on television. And I've always liked him. I always thought he was a bright, likable guy.
Who is the athlete that I would say the most different in person than that they were portrayed in the media? It doesn't have to be negative or positive, just someone that is completely different than how they were on TV or how they were portrayed.
Well, the ones that I have never really gotten to know. I never got to know Tom Brady. I never got to know Michael Jordan or LeBron. My read on Tiger was that it was his relationship with his father that both made him and made him break away. I mean, I think that Tiger went into some sort of strange fugue state where he was, fucking all these high-class whores, and then ultimately crashed his car, which, although may well have been deeply under the influence of whatever, I'm not so sure that was as accidental as it was a cry for help. The only thing that, socially acceptable way to get out of a problem or a relationship is some bizarre response to it, whether it's crashing your car or, in Mike Tyson's case, biting Holyfield's ear. Now, he knew he was going to lose that fight, but in his own sense of self, there was no way he could allow himself to be a loser. But if you're disqualified by the referee, hey, that has nothing to do with you. You didn't do that. Someone else did that. And so I think that biting that ear was kind of also a way of getting out of this impossible situation. And I think in some ways, Tiger did the same thing. His life was no longer under control, obviously. And he was going to be, blackmailed up the hill eventually. And so he crashed the car and everything blew up. And of course, he's had physical problems as well. But it's so interesting. Maybe people intrinsically understand this about him, because I've never understood this kind of, what I sense is a kind of affection or hero worship or fandom, perhaps, towards Tiger Woods, who in person tends to be kind of a surly asshole. He's not a warm, fuzzy, nice guy. I mean, who's a warm? Joe Namath, warm and fuzzy, nice guy. Really? Do people feel about him that way? I think they do. I think that comes through. But your point is well taken. I think that it's even harder now to really get a read on who somebody is, with all the layers of publicity and press agentry and television of who they, really are. Patrick Mahomes, he really seems like a warm, fuzzy guy. I don't know him. I've never met him. But his commercials, his interviews, he just seemed this guy, nice, cuddly, a little tall, but nice, cuddly human being. Is he really that way? I don't know. You always get to talk at some point with somebody who was close or worked closely with somebody who has been at a remove from the public. They say, oh, he's warm and he's nice and he's really a good guy, or like that. And, who knows? The closest I came is many years ago. I got very close to Bill Bradley when he was playing basketball for the Knicks, eventually became a senator, or like that, in public with fans. And ultimately, when he was campaigning for the Senate and for the presidency, he came across as very wooden and kind of close-lipped and a little sour. Home over a beer, he was one of the funniest, warmest, nicest guys in public life I've ever met. But that never, ever came through. He always seemed, kind of this Princeton elitist jerk. So I don't know. It would be so interesting, if you could log time with some of these guys. And then there are guys like Jim Brown, who was as scary in person, hanging out, as he was in public. And then there's Billie Jean King, who's as nice and as much fun, in any way. So I don't know. It's a really good question, Jesse. And I think in some ways it almost doesn't matter, because people are willing to just take them in the way in which they need them. We need Aaron Rodgers as this smart-ass conspiracy theorist. We need George Foreman as the biggest, cuddliest guy you've ever met. And he is very nice, actually. So I don't know, these characters almost created for us, and we take them in the ways that we need them. Look at how is it possible for half the country to want Donald Trump to die, and the other half to think he's some sort of ultimate incarnate of our leader and hero. Beats me. Life's too complicated. But as they say, God's great, beer's good, people crazy.
You've written over a dozen books. You have a memoir called An Accidental Sports Writer. You've been at the New York Times since 1957. What's a parting thought or a concluding thought that we should wrap up this podcast with today?
Well, I have to tell you that of all of these things, the greatest pleasure has really come from, I've written 13 young adult novels. These are novels for kids from about 14 to 18. I started doing it during a Muhammad Ali fight where an old boxing manager, Customato, told me about a gym that he used to own with 3 flights of stairs. And he would live and work on the top of the stairs, and he would listen for kids coming up the stairway. And if a kid came up scared, tentatively, but forced, his fear and kept coming up, he knew that the kid would have the opportunity to become a contender, to become somebody. And that kind of inflamed me. And I wrote a book called The Contender about a kid coming up those stairs. And the reaction to it was just so wonderful. In most all my sports writing, somebody says, you are brilliant or you are incredibly stupid. Whether or not I agree with what they're saying. Here, my readers, 14 to 18-year-old, mostly boys, internalized the characters. The main character, Alfred, they said, would they have done what Alfred did? And when they wrote to me, and I used to visit schools a lot, talk to kids who'd read the book, they would talk to me as if my characters were real human beings, old friends of theirs that they had met, who had problems that they had to deal with and that they had to deal with in their lives. So in terms of satisfaction as a writer, to have that kind of response to something that you're writing about is thrilling and has always been, in fact, I just about 3 days ago mailed in a new book, emailed in a new book. I'm still writing about it. I'm still getting pleasure out of that. And that's always been another thread. I still do sports writing, and I still do that. And I get, I guess, a certain pleasure out of that kind of friction, the rub of sports writers, where people say, you're a genius or you're a jerk, and then talk about it. But I think that nothing really gives me the intrinsic pleasure. And I've written, novels for older people as well, but you don't get the same kind of response. It's a more sophisticated response. Well, I read your book. They don't tell you whether they liked it or not. Well, but in young adult fiction, there's this kind of real, authentic response where kids read about it. I taught for a while at Wake Forest University, and there's a group down there, basically football players on the Wake Forest team, who have been going into high schools with basically The Contender more than my other books, and helping at-risk high school kids to read and with their studies, with the idea that a book about sports is kind of a way in. And most of my young adult novels have a sports background of some kind, every sport that I've covered. And that, of course, makes sense, too, because as you remember from the beginning of our conversation, that's what I thought I was going to be doing with my life, sitting in a corner making up stuff instead of, going to the arena, trying to make sense of what I'm seeing in front of me. So in about a year from now, when we talk again, we'll talk about Rhino's Run, which is the new book being published by HarperCollins, who've published all my books since The Contender, the 60s. And we'll be back in business.
Okay. Yeah, well, thanks so much, Bob, for joining us today.
I thought you really gave a brilliantly close reading of the book. Man, you know that book better than anybody now. And thank you for it. I enjoyed your questions, and I appreciate the way you let me talk on and on.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.